Well, welcome to this special episode of Planet Possible. I'm joined today by two voices that will be familiar to regular listeners, John Curtin, the Chief Executive of the Environment Agency, and Al Chisholm, who's the Director of Policy at CIWEM. It's lovely to see you both. We're here today to have a bit of a conversation about a really big topic, really, about the future of water. And we're gonna get into that in a second. And if you want to find out more about that, then we're not going to cover everything in the pod today. There won't be time. So Al is writing this up on the CIWEM.org website. Head to that and have a search for a freshwater future, and you'll be able to find more detail about the conversation that you're going to hear today. So John, let's kick off. Last year, your predecessor said we need a complete gear change on water management. I guess we would say, with our CIWEM hat on, we probably need a freshwater future. Do you agree? And I guess if you do, what does that look like for you?
So I do agree because actually when you reflect back the last couple of years, and some of you will know that I used to work in the flood risk management side of the Environment Agency, and post the floods in Somerset in 2013, 2014, I think one of the biggest things that hit me is we need a real strategy. You know, you're going to have climate throwing things at you. You've got population growth. You need a way forward, a sort of a North Star you can follow. And probably what we've lacked is the equivalent in water for the last few years. And I think the good news is the launch of the Integrated Plan for Water a few months ago. It's interesting because it's quite a fanfare about things like wet wipes, not using plastic disposable wet wipes, which, by the way, shouldn't be used. And I have actually had the pleasure of removing blockages from sewers for a water company to see that what happens, and it's not something I want to repeat. But actually, beyond those sort of headlines, when I was talking to the DEFRA policy team about it, and this is not a political point, the DEFRA policy team about it, I said this was my equivalent of a water Christmas. It is the best combination of different features that we've had for years. And I think the key task, though, is you launch a plan, and sometimes those people who work so hard on these plans do a big sigh of relief and then stop. It's now the baton's to us to actually make it happen. And one of the features of the plan, which we all know if you've worked for a long time, but being expressed in a government document, is about integrated catchment management. I've seen so many great ideas floating around recently. You've had ELMS, as in the Environment Land Management System, that's going to pay farmers for public good. You've got the Integrated Plan for Water, you've got some of our flood work. What's probably lacking is how do all those elements, those investments and regulatory features come together towards how you improve a particular catchment. And that'll be different in the uplands of Cumbria as it will be in South London rivers. You know, so what we really need is how are all those features going to get together in a plan for a catchment that recognises place and includes local authorities and includes communities. So yes, we need a new start, a new strategy, but the good news is I think we've got one. We've just got to make it happen.
I want us to get into that in a bit more detail. I think we will in a few moments. I think that's doesn't sound like the easiest thing to do, but it sounds really very necessary. I guess thinking about why there's a driver for all of this alongside all of the science-based reasons, it feels to me certainly that water and the environment are in the public consciousness at a level at which I can't remember, I guess, recently in recent history. It's really prominent, but how do we harness that? Yeah,
here's an example of why it is really in people's minds, not just on the headlines that people will see every now and again. If you're not aware, the Office of National Statistics, and do Google it, they do a public opinions trend. So every quarter they'll ask the UK public, what is the most important things to this nation, right? And the last one they did was only a week ago. Unsurprisingly, cost of living crisis is number one. But fourth most important element to the UK public at the moment, fourth, was climate change and the environment. That's above education, that's above crime, that's above even international conflict. So the fourth most important thing to people in this nation is climate change and the environment. And the reason why that's also important, not just, that's great that people are really feeling that connection to the environment. It's also quite unusual in my career because people's love for the environment has been a cyclical thing depending on how the economy is doing. So if the economy is doing great, people say, yes, we can invest in the environment and that's good. If the economy gets really tough, no, we can't afford all that green stuff. We're talking about difficult economic times where people still want the green and climate change elements to their lives. And actually, if you look at the last survey the Office of National Statistics did, they did a whole special thing about what does your career look like and how connected do you think it is to the environment. And it was quite interesting that something like 20-30% of the people they talked to said they have some sort of climate or green element to their job and they're proud of it. This is really meaning something to people, and the responsibility for someone like myself is how we harness that, like you say, but also make the improvements that people demand and want.
Yeah, So I guess I'm going to ask you again, how do we harness it then?
I mean, this is the big question. I mean, if I'm allowed to go back to the integrated plan for water, It is how do we make the things that were listed happen? The ultimate goal, though, I think, is one of the interesting things in some of these plans, and we talked a little bit about this when we did the apology from Water UK, is what I would like to move from is there's a lot in the plans now about how you should increase punishments, right? And also that fines for water companies and others should be invested back in the environment, which, by the way, is a good thing, rather than just going into a treasury coffer. But wouldn't it be great if there were no fines? And I talked about this last time. Wouldn't it be great if I didn't have to deploy resources in the EA to the 53 criminal prosecutions we've had to do for water companies before? So I think, yes, there is some stages about how we really tease out making sure it really hurts when people hurt the environment. But the ultimate goal is that we really know what value we place on water, and that's the heart of it. I think water is completely undervalued as a commodity. And sorry, the other bit on the integrated plan for water, there's a lot of headlines around water quality, but let's not forget water resources. You know, it's only last year we were hitting 40 degrees temperatures in this country. We have drought plans that usually take weeks to go through the stages of progressing towards drought, and they did it in a matter of days rather than weeks. The world is changing us around us, and we've really got to reach for it. And you say, how do we make it happen? One of the bits I've been talking about in drought is I'm not into just looking at last year and how do we learn from last year, because all that does is make you better at doing yesterday's problem. Other countries are already living our climate future for water, so we should be looking to what they're doing there and building that into what we do in our infrastructure, in our regulation, in preparing agriculture for the sort of climate shocks that come. So rather than just being this constant cycle of being better at yesterday's crisis, we know what's coming. Let's just get ready for that now.
Yeah, the past feels like it's no longer the key to the future. Yeah, interesting. Al?
John, how do you perceive that the EA's role is evolving from a catchment delivery perspective, picking up this trend of integrated catchment delivery? Do we need something akin to a catchment system operator? That's something, again, a bit geeky in our world that has been discussed quite a lot, but an entity to strategically prioritise those actions in catchments. And if so, who? Yeah. What would they look like? Who would they be?
So I think Dieter Helm, didn't he, talked a lot about this operator system, and I think he was starting to look at someone controlling the resources. That's quite ambitious. And the one thing I learned from my time in flood is the power of convening people, especially if you can link them back to a united view on a strategy. My view is we need partnerships convened at real local place with catchments. And I think the EA could certainly, the Environment Agency could certainly play a key part in that convening, because one of our real strength is our evidence and data. The evidence and data we have that we make transparent and open to others is there to show what a particular demand or pressure on a catchment is, and then what are the joint solutions we can all bring to the table to do them. So for me, Al, if I go back to the flood world where there's probably 80 or 90 different groups that come together to make a more resilient community or place, I would see, rather than someone having the direct power to have all of that money and strings, you know, to all of that cash, is someone who really can convene, bring people together. The biggest problem to all of it, and I said this in the launch for the integrated plan for water, is trust. There's so much trust been lost in sectors, probably regulators. We have to rebuild the trust to know that we have the ability and the will to make the changes necessary. So the trust element is really important, which is why I welcomed Water UK's apology as a first step to recognise we haven't got this right, move on.
This is interesting because one of the things that organisations have identified as potentially being able to help the likes of water companies start to rebuild trust is delivering through nature-based solutions, because they can be very visible. They show that they're contributing to nature recovery and climate adaptation and so on. Nikki and I visited Spain's Hall in Essex a while ago to record an episode of the podcast where they've got beavers and they're doing a whole raft of other nature-based solutions delivery. That really got us thinking how big we can go through those kind of approaches. How far do you think we can? Are we just scratching the surface through things like natural flood management? If we take on board regenerative farming and those kind of techniques as well, and how do we build a real landscape approach?
So there is massive opportunity, and just to show you the journey on natural flood management, which I think is a good example, natural flood management used to be the thing you got to when you couldn't do anything else. you would try and do a big capital scheme. If you couldn't do that, you might do individual property resilience. If you couldn't do that, well, let's see if we can fiddle around with the catchment, right? The biggest shift in the flood strategy, which will now, I think, move into the water strategy, is realising that resilience is built through a mosaic of different interventions of different scale, and the use of the environment or working with environment as part of that is a key part of this resilience. So having a conversation about whether you do green or grey is a non-conversation. You do both, right? And that's why we go back to the conversation we just had, is you need to plan for each catchment and know what are the challenges here, and therefore what the interventions will work. And a reason why I think that's important as well is otherwise we'll reach a situation with, say, farm payments where farmers just say, I would like to do this, can you please pay me to do it? And it might be planting trees in the wrong place, or it might be maize crop in the wrong catchment. We need something where you can really incentivise the right interventions, be it farmers, ourselves, partners, in the right place. So knowing that nature is an integrated part of an overall mosaic of water quality improvements and climate resilience is really important. It's actually great if you talk to the Dutch, who I know the Dutch are traditionally in the flood world considered as sort of just an engineering. They are great at doing all the multiple benefits of nature. They describe nature-based solutions as a climate buffer as well. So it buys them time to adjust an asset base as well. So it's something that can go in combination with to be that shock absorber against climate alongside. Now, I was in Devon last week to see that flash flooding that happened. Yeah. And that was runoff straight from different fields and from actually nature reserves as well. So unless you recognise all of the different elements that come together, you're going to have a blind spot.
Planet Possible is sponsored by Scube, who are at the forefront of innovation, collaboration, digital excellence and customer experience. They help to enable their customers to continuously improve operational efficiencies whilst recognising the importance of and addressing industry-wide challenges such as climate change, the journey to net zero and regularly evolving regulation. At their heart, Scube believe collaboration with customers and industry partners is fundamental to building transformative solutions across the utility sector that ultimately benefit their customers, the consumer, and our environment. So if I was to be a little challenging, I guess then, what you've talked about in principle sounds like utopia. If we think about that catchment approach in practice, the objectives of a water company, of private landowners, of agriculture, of the agency, of all of those kind of other stakeholders, ENGOs in a catchment, their objectives may not necessarily align, or if nothing else, they may not have shared visibility. So how do we tie together water management, flood management? How do we make that happen, I suppose, is what I'm saying really, John, when people can't always see what everyone else is dealing with?
So, again, using my experience before when you do the catchment work, is people enter rooms usually with misunderstandings and misconceptions of each other, but I'm actually pretty convinced that 95% of everyone's objectives of catchment are broadly the same. And actually the multiple benefits, people think of beavers, reintroducing beavers as an element of micro flood management. The time I saw them working the best when I was on the River Otter was during that drought of last year, and I saw the drone footage of the side of the river that was where the beavers are dammed and the side not, and the total difference in the water availability and also quality. So there will be differences, but I actually think the differences are much smaller than the gains and the collective view together. I'm an optimist and someone who wants to really drive forward, but I'm also a realist, and I have seen catchment approaches peter out. I don't think it's so much how you bring people together, it's how you sustain them. And one of the examples will be after the 15-16 floods, there was quite a lot of catchment partnership groups that started and had a lot of energy and a lot of visibility politically. 4 or 5 years of no drought, and they're still there, but they're not having the same impact. So I think it is a real cultural shift about how we feel we own the water landscape collectively with all partners. Because going back to your point as well, is what worries me the most is, at the moment, is the water debate is almost becoming toxic. And so it's great to have this conversation in one sense, because given my personal view, you need to blend my view with other people's perspective to give an overall direction, because at the moment it's becoming a bit of a zero-sum game. And here's a bit of breaking news for you, right? Bit of controversy here. Some water companies do really good stuff on the environment. And I'm worried that any time they try and do something, or a river trust works in partnership with a water company, they get batted down. Now that sort of erosion of people trying to do great things for the environment is going to mean we'll all lose, right? So I think we really do need a more nuanced debate. I love the EA. I've worked in the EA for 30 odd years. Like most things you love, it's got blind spots and you need to recognise those. But there's 12,000 passionate people in the EA that get up every morning to make a difference, a positive difference to their local environment and their local communities. And sometimes when I see the way that they're described on social media, I think you've just not met these people. Yeah. It's a lazy approach, and all you're doing is eroding morale and loading the passion. But I am optimistic. I think most of what everyone I've seen, be it water companies, I went out on a farm visit the other day where a farmer transformed completely his dairy farm when he really understood the impact he was having on the river in Devon. It's an absolute transformation. Most of what we believe is aligned, and that goes right back to my first point, which is what the public want. If the public think climate change and the environment is the fourth most important thing facing this nation, then most of the groups involved with the communities as well will be thinking the same as us. And it's how we align that energy together in one direction rather than just rubbing up against each other and all of our energy lost in friction with each other.
OK, John, I'm really interested. There's a raft of water challenges that we're facing at the moment. So of all of those that we're facing at the moment, where can we make the most progress as quickly as possible? And which of the issues are the toughest ones to crack as far as you're concerned?
So I'll start with tough first, then we can finish on a positive. So it is great that we're having all these conversations about water quality. I do worry about water resources. If you had to ask me what I worry about most, it is sea level rise and climate change, okay? Because I don't think we've even begun to experience that. There's a paragraph hidden in one of the IPCC reports they released between the big ones. They did one on cryosphere because they were quite worried about the pace of melting in Greenland, etc. And there's a paragraph which I've pretty much burned on my mind, but apologies to those listening if it's not word for word, but it says, by 2050, what is currently a once-in-a-century coastal storm will be an annual event. And here's the killer line, under all climate scenarios. So even if we didn't produce another gram in the world of carbon dioxide, that is the future that's coming with the inertia and the movement in the climate change that's already happening and will happen. That is a future that's coming. All right? And as someone who's had a lot of experience in crisis management, the good news is you don't often get 30 years notice of a crisis arriving. The bad news is humans aren't wired to deal with those longer term issues. And 2050 feels like a long way away. But as someone who deals in 6-year capital cycles, we're only talking a few cycles to deal with a completely different future. Because what on earth does a once in a century storm look like in 2050? As we're an island that's mostly built upon sea trade, think about it, most of our cities are either on estuaries or on the coast, apart from your likes of Birmingham where they've got good groundwater. We're really exposed. That is the problem that we really face. That is an inevitability that's coming. And we have the notice. I think we have the time. It's just the choice is how we use that time.
If we take that a little further then and think about the balance between adaptation and resilience, really, and the balance between community scale resilience and maybe something that's at a national level. Yeah. Is that balance? Have we got the balance right at the moment? Are we ready for that change?
One of the real privileges of this job is I go and see what happens in other parts of the world, and I saw this balance between community resilience and infrastructure resilience described, which, just bear with me and I'll try and paint the picture for you. But basically it was saying that in developing countries, in the past they haven't had as much money to invest in infrastructure like coastal defences. So they have built quite a lot of community resilience to the climate shocks we face. The counter to that in more developed countries, and we've certainly done this since the major flood in 1953 where, 307 people lost their lives, defences were fractured in 1,200 places, but we've spent 2 generations of trying to engineering out the risk, which has eroded communities' resilience or understanding. I call it the myth of protection. We do provide better flood protection to people in this nation, but you're never fully protected. So we have to rebalance that, yes, investment in infrastructure, but also the investment in communities for their resilience. And there's some difficult choices to come, and it's going to be bold politicians that can lead it. The bit I want to try and get is climate mitigation is now painted as quite rightly, a nice, bright future. Green jobs, green energy, clean cars, right? It's a positive vision of an economy. We need to paint the same picture for adaptation. Because as humans, we've always adapted. The coast has always changed. Great images in the turn of the century of people at the East Coast used to attach their houses to steam engines, and they would drag them every second winter away from the cliffs. So we were doing this 100 years ago. So if we can just paint the same bright future for adaptation, which is what we naturally do as humans as we do mitigation, that'll be the success.
So you just touched on the word leadership, and I think you said bold leadership. In your view, who's leading the overall response to the climate and ecological emergency? Talk about the UK.
Who's leading? That's controversial. I think we're collectively dealing with the tactical issues that we face, and I think it's good that the net zero discussion has happened. I don't think we've really seen strong leadership on adaptation for what's going to come. I have to say, and I would say this perhaps because it's part of the work I did, the EA strategy for flood risk was probably the boldest I've seen, because it said this isn't a strategy for 5 years, 10 years, this is a strategy for generations. That myth of protection, I said, that's generations where people have had the risk sort of taken away in their mindset. It'll be generations to move back. So I think we've got a good role in it. I think, to be fair on governments, the last few years, pandemics, cost of living crisis, war in Europe, I can see why you'd want to be talking about today's problems first before tomorrow. So let's give them all a break. But as we emerge from those things, let's know that that picture I painted for sea level rise and coastal change is coming. And as I said, it's just a choice of how we use the time till it comes.
So maybe, I guess, a final sort of push on from that, given the challenges you've just talked about, what is inevitably coming down the tracks? Have we got the EA that we need? Does it need to be bigger?
I don't think it needs to be bigger, actually. So all of the politicians listening to me will be very pleased. But I think the Environment Agency itself needs to do a couple of things. We do need to embrace innovation and digital world. I was saying this recently. You probably all know Sir James Bevan left as the CEO. What you might not know is I had to do 5 speeches for Sir James. And the last one I did write using a chatbot because I was running out of things to do, which was a fascinating experience. And then I suddenly thought, this tech could be used for all sorts of stuff, but we're not doing it. And the weird thing about digital, of course, is those like myself leading an organisation are probably the least equipped to make decisions around it because we've been around too long. So we need a more of digital revolution of really understanding data, analysing. We're a real data-rich organisation, but information light. We don't analyse it well enough. So that's one area. The other area for me with the Environment Agency, and I think we've got much better at this, but when I think of my career, when I started as a hydrologist, the way you were approached was, here's a problem facing a community, I'm the expert, I will study it for a bit and then bless that community with my expertise, right? And shock horror, they didn't seem very pleased with it and they all had different ideas. So really, really listening to communities, involving them. It's difficult. What is a community? 2 sides of a street can have a completely different view, but really listening to what people are telling us, really trying to understand, and going back to that, convening all of us and all our expertise and perspectives to come to those solutions. That's the way we get through it.
So I'm going to do what I always do at the end of every Planet Possible, and I'm going to gift you the Planet Possible magic wand, John. If you could wave it and make one of them possible.
So as I said, I'm really worried about sea level rise, right? But it's not because it's an incremental thing. It can cause catastrophes. So what I would like with my magic wand is bring the lessons learned report from the 20x coastal storm, and someone's brought it now, and we start implementing those lessons learned that someone has to do after a major catastrophe and make sure they're in place before that happens.
Getting us really ready. Yeah. Well, that's it for now, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
Planet Possible is produced by Bulb. BWLB Bulb. The best ideas, the strongest content.